Hey everybody, Coach Toolshed here, and in today's video I will not be discussing why Randy Pitchford has yet to defend himself against allegations of a physical assault that may or may not have occurred in 2017. That is not the purpose of today's video, and we will not be discussing it. Instead, today we will be discussing a couple of new news items and showing how they tie together because these two items are very much intertwined. Now, the first thing I want to discuss, which you may or may not already know, because there's been a lot of talk about it today, a U.S. Senator from Missouri has announced that he is planning on introducing legislation regarding loot boxes, specifically designed at banning them outright and certain free-to-play mechanics, specifically in games targeting young children under the age of 18. Now, the first thing we need to clear up right away, I've seen a lot of people saying that this bill, this guy's introduced a bill. No, at this point, he actually is just grandstanding and talking about it. He has not yet introduced the bill at all. So this is something that is still very much theoretical. It's important to keep that in mind. There has been no paperwork actually filed at this point. He is just right now discussing it, a plan that he is planning on proposing. So that is important to keep in mind. Second of all, a lot of people are sort of just announcing this as an outright ban on loot boxes, but in the bill as he described it, this is not going to be a situation where he's planning on outlawing loot boxes entirely. It's specifically in games that are designed for children and played by children, and for games that companies know where children are actively playing it. So presumably this means a game like Call of Duty, which carries an M rating from the ESRB, and they will come into this in a second. A game that has an M rating presumably could be excluded from legislation like this because it is not, theoretically, a game designed at kids, although that does not stop 12-year-olds from babbling into the mic every time they headshot you. That is up to the parents if they want to buy the game, but the game does carry an M rating. What this could mean, though, is that if EA wants to keep loot boxes in their games like FIFA and Madden, which is highly profitable for them, which is what we will be discussing in just a bit here, they will be faced with a choice if this legislation passes where they would have to either remove the loot boxes or maybe put an M rating on their games, which they certainly won't want to do. FIFA and Madden have an E for everyone rating, and so that is something where they can use to sell to people of all ages with no restrictions whatsoever. Like I said, it's not like kids can't get their hands on M-rated games. Parents are often very naive about this. They will just go and buy the games anyway. So it's not like sales would necessarily be hugely negatively impacted. So EA might be able to skirt this as well if they just maybe wanted to put an M rating on their game, which I don't think they would want to do just for the optics of it, because it would be kind of silly to have a sports game with an M rating, but this is a way where they might be able to skirt that sort of legislation. But anyway, regardless of all that, I don't really think that this bill is going to get too far. The ESRB is a very powerful lobbying group which was started by the video game industry back in the mid-90s as a way to shield them and protect them against legislation like this specifically, and they have already come out with a rebuttal to the senator saying that there's several countries that have already said that loot boxes are not gambling and therefore do not need to be legislated or restricted. Conveniently, the ESRB's response left out countries like Belgium and other countries that are investigating it, specifically Belgium, which has already come out and said, no, loot boxes are gambling in our determination, and therefore they are banned in that country. We know Activision, EA, and Take-Two, amongst others, were forced to remove loot boxes in that country, which I consider to be a win for gamers everywhere, and the companies, of course, see that otherwise. But the purpose of this video is not necessarily to discuss this legislation, which, once again, like I said, I don't think this is going to get too far. I think this will eventually get shot down if it even gets to the floor of the Senate to begin with. But the purpose of today's video is I want to tie this into some interesting information that came out today. Today, the website Motley Fool put out a full transcript of the EA earnings call with their investors. It featured Andrew Wilson and Blake Jorgensen from EA discussing various ins and outs of the business and where their current franchises are at, and discuss some of their plans for the future, including the fact that they expect Respawn Entertainment's newest Star Wars game, the single-player game with no microtransactions, they expect that game to have sales between 6 to 8 million copies, which actually could be reachable for a brand like Star Wars if EA doesn't actually step in and screw things up, if they actually allow Respawn Entertainment to go through with it and make a quality single-player game with no multiplayer to worry about and no microtransactions weighing it down with negative publicity. That might actually be a reachable goal. And in addition to what we saw yesterday when I discussed how Sekiro really pleased Activision with their publishing thing, we might see a bit of a change in the winds with these AAA publishers, maybe finally waking up to the fact that they can sell lots of copies of games and make a tidy profit just by servicing the single-player market, which is still there regardless of the fact that all of these companies want to push games as a service titles. However, we also need to get into the meat of the investor report, which involves the finances, which show a bit of a different picture, which many people may suspect, because aside from Anthem, which they said several times did not meet expectations, largely most of the other projects that they worked on this past year they were actually pretty pleased with. But a couple things caught my eye, specifically when they discussed the mobile gaming revenue, because as we know, one of the biggest problems creeping its way into console and PC gaming is more of a mobile aspect. Companies are starting to put out more and more of these garbage mobile games and bringing the monetization tactics associated with those mobile games into different platforms and away from smartphones and tablets. And of course, I don't think too many of us are very happy with that encroachment. But interestingly, what EA said is their mobile sales for last year and the revenue brought in by that was actually down 23%, which is certainly not inconsequential. A 23% reduction is kind of a problem. Now, one of the main things that they pointed to was that they did not meet expectations when it came to revenue for the game Command & Conquer. Now, if you recall, that is a game that got very heavily criticized by many people because when they announced the game, people were expecting it to be a full Command & Conquer game on PC and whatnot, and they did not react kindly to the mobile announcement. So similar to what we saw with Blizzard when they announced Diablo, we had a similar reaction from Command & Conquer fans when EA announced that game. And it was interesting to see that because of that game, which they were not counting on failing as much as it did, they had a situation where they lost almost a quarter year over year out of their revenue from the mobile stream. Now, it is important to keep in mind that even with the 23% loss of the mobile sales, what they still had was a 40% of their overall revenue from gaming actually still came in from the mobile market. So even though that particular segment was down year over year, it still represents a huge amount of their profits. And of course, that's why we're going to see more and more push into the mobile gaming space, which I don't think any of us want to see. But it looks like it might be inevitable for a few years here as they try to push us further and further into this ridiculous monetization, because that's what they want to do. Now, it's also important to keep in mind, in the earnings call, they also discussed how Madden and FIFA, specifically the Ultimate Team components, were actually making more money year over year. So that is a market which is continuing to grow for them, which is the most troubling thing, because as they see that they can make more and more money with what I regard to be the worst monetization practices in the entire industry, Ultimate Teams for sports games are a huge money maker and they're extremely predatory. And as I have discussed on the channel before, one of the issues with sports games is a lot of people who play sports games only play sports games. They're not really tuned in with the more gamer-centric conversations, the conversations that we have here on this channel. As you know, I don't really cover sports games. And a lot of people in the YouTube space don't really cover sports games at all. We look at those as sort of more casualized games, and so all the money they're making off of these products is coming from what we would view as a more casualized gamer base. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, it's just a fact of the matter. Those games sell millions and millions of copies every year. They're almost always in the top 10 every single year for total game sales, and a lot of that is from people that don't play really any other games. And so that is a marketplace that EA has thoroughly latched onto, and that is the market where we know they make the most amount of their money, which, like I said, this does tie into the proposed the unproposed legislation that we discussed earlier. If EA were forced to do something about the loot boxes, that would truly significantly destroy their entire business model. Now, something to keep in mind also is that Andrew Wilson in this earnings call did finally acknowledge, maybe for the first time that Andrew Wilson actually had to acknowledge something here, is that the way that they go about making games, specifically in regards to games like Anthem, these live service games, the model where they go through the marketing process, hyping up the game and drip feeding us content and slowly building a pipe, he has finally admitted that maybe that's not the best way to go about doing it, and he said that their marketing tactics are going to shift in the future, although it did sound like he's going to be trying to copy the marketing tactics from the Asian markets. I don't know if that's A, going to translate into Western audiences, and B, if that's necessarily even better. You might think that if Andrew Wilson is keen to switch up to a new business tactic, it might not be the most consumer friendly. Now, he can try to sugarcoat all he wants, but this is the same guy who multiple times during this earnings call referred to games like Madden and FIFA as, quote, innovative. Madden is innovative, Andrew, is it? That's interesting. Madden's been around since the 80s, and I would say it is largely the same as it was in the 80s. It was maybe the least innovative series in all of gaming. Also, something I found funny in the interview, they said that they have been doubling down on the production of Anthem. Well, if you consider pulling off key players and moving them onto Dragon Age 4, which is the next game you're going to be trying to market from BioWare, if you consider completely scrapping the roadmap and putting a to be determined when it's actually going to be coming out, if you consider that doubling down on production of a game, I would hate to see what would happen if you guys actually decided to abandon the project. It seems like that's what you're doing already. Anyway, that's it from me, Coach Toolshed. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Please subscribe if you want to stay in tune with the channel headed forward. And as always, keep it turned to 11.